Hey everybody, and welcome into Tales from the Vault Thursday. Today, we are going to be traveling to Kingsport, Tennessee, into the home of Rotherwood Mansion. We're going to be visiting Rotherwood Mansion. It is a beautiful home that is built on the banks of the Holston River in Kingsport, Tennessee. There's lots of legends and lots of stories about this. It's said to be extremely haunted house. So let's get into this story. It's quite extensive. Sitting on the very banks of the Holston River, Hound of Hell, sits a majestic manor home with red bricks, dark shutters, and breathtaking 30-foot-high Doric columns that line the front porch, giving anyone who stands on the porch a commanding view of the river and the lands beyond. At 3 stories tall, this stately home is in fact a source of all of Kingsport, or what would be the town later on. Its intricate ties to the city make it a source of great pride and haunting, creeping dread for those that live near it. Some bear the scars, quite literally, from the house and its sordid past. It even has a name pulled from the works of Sir Walter Scott's 1820 novel, Ivanhoe. The character, Cedric the Saxon, Rotherwood. Rotherwood, as so many places like it, did not begin with malice or evil, but its fate, and often those who are tied to it, were doomed the moment the first brick was laid. In the latter part of the 18th century, a young man named Frederick Ross and his family inherited a large parcel of land of several hundred acres along the north and south forks of Holston River. The land ran from Bays Mountain to almost the Virginia border. Ross and his family were very wealthy and were greatly respected in the area. Ross himself would later go on to lay out the town of Kingsport, Rossville, which obviously later became Kingsport, that we know today. Like most wealthy families in the South, and at that time, the Ross did own slaves. He also had several indentured white servants as well, but was not known to be a cruel man. He treated his slaves well, considering the circumstances of the immorality at the act of slavery. Unlike many Southern slave owners, he did not engage in wanton cruelty. In 1818, the work on the majestic plantation house that was Rotherwood was finished. The house and grounds were truly the showplace and entertainment center of the entire region. With curved driveways and column-lined porches, hanging floral gardens, and even a pool on the roof, Rotherwood was every bit the dream house of the Ross family. Ross had several children, but everyone remembers his daughter Rowena the best. With her raven hair and fair complexion, she was considered to be the most beautiful creature in the entire area, and she had an education and manners to back it up. Well liked and kind to everyone she met, slaves included. Rowena had many young men chasing after her hand in marriage, but there was only one gentleman that caught her affections and held them close. Ross was himself beyond happy with his daughter's choice, and went on to build another Rotherwood across the river from the main house for his daughter and soon-to-be family. He relished the idea of being a grandfather, and the new house was completed. It was an exact replica of Rotherwood itself, but instead of red brick, the entire house was entirely in white. Unfortunately, it never was lived in because it burned to the ground not long after completion. Perhaps that was an omen of things to come, perhaps not. But what happened next was nothing short of devastating. Perhaps the event on a day of joy was what started the downward spiral of Rotherwood into darkness. On her wedding day, Rowena and her family and the groom and his family had gathered before the ceremony, laughing and rejoicing. The groom and several of his friends decided to try their hand at fishing before he married his fiancée. Taking a small boat out onto the Holston River, the men were in plain sight of the house, and as Rowena watched, her life changed and fate dealt her a cruel hand. The Holston River is notorious for its dangerous currents and eddies, and somehow the boat the men were in capsized, spilling them into the icy water. Everyone on shore watched in horror as the men struggled in the water, the raging currents pulling them under. Miraculously, 3 of the men made it back to shore. But to Rowena's devastation, her fiancé did not. In fact, his body was never recovered. Rowena was devastated by this loss and fell into a deep depression. The once vibrant, beautiful young woman became a virtual recluse, secluding herself away in her 3rd-story bedroom, looking out at her window at the river, silently mourning her lost love and life. For 2 years, Rowena saw no one, but gradually began to come out again, socializing in small bursts until a man happened to cross her path, and again, she felt the pull of love. This rich young man was from Knoxville, and while he was not her first love, she was willing to try love again. She was able to marry this man. Fate, however, struck once again. Another wave of grief slamming into her as her new husband passed not long after their wedding vows from yellow fever. Once again, Rowena fell into a depression, and this time, it did not break for more than a decade. One last time, Rowena tried to be happy, and she did marry again. And this time, her life seemed to be on the right track. She even had a daughter with her new husband, and for 6 years, she finally seemed to find happiness. But something was just never quite right. It is unknown how or why, but what is known to her is how her story finally came to a tragic end. What is known is this. During a vacation back at Rotherwood to see her father, Rowena said she had seen the ghost of her first love, her true love. She had said that she had heard his ghostly voice calling to her and seen his pale white hand reach out to her from the dark waters of the Holston and beckon to her. That night, she slipped into her wedding gown, the garment flowing behind her like angels' white wings as she made her way silently outside late at night. Barefoot, following the trail to the shores of the river before slowly and calmly wading into the water, walking until the water was up to her neck, and finally she vanished below the surface, taking her own life. From that point, the fate of Rotherwood was doomed to be a bleak one. The once happy Frederick Ross was himself in a deep depression over the loss of his daughter. And in years leading up to the Civil War, he made several business decisions that seemed to backfire. Huge losses and failed investments that cost him dearly. His overseer, Joshua Phillips, was also a bookkeeper. Strangely, he never seemed to understand why his employer's ventures were failing. Ross saw only one way out of the failing plantation and made a heartbreaking decision. He sold Rotherwood Plantation to the only person he knew could afford it, and the losses it had taken, Joshua Phillips. Before the sale, however, Ross made one decision that was the forerunner of the hell to come. He freed as many slaves as he could before transferring ownership to Phillips. These freed slaves settled further away from Rotherwood into Hawkins County in a place called Zion Hill. Ross had freed slaves because he knew what was coming. The storm that was incarnate in a man named Joshua Phillips. Ross left his once happy manor and grounds, and the remaining slaves he could not free in the hands of Phillips, and left by a carriage to his fate. He would pass years later as a broken man. Phillips, on the other hand, would have a short but unforgettable tenure as Lord and Master of Rotherwood Plantation. Even before his passing, Phillips was known in his day for his malice, his cruelty, and his irritable nature. The only thing that held him in check as overseer of the slaves and grounds was the hand of his employer, Ross. Now that Ross was out of the picture, Phillips had total control of the manor and the slaves, and it's not a far stretch to say that hell was unleashed the day he took control. Rotherwood began to change. Slave cells were added inside the basement with dirt walls, dirt floors, and no windows, with only one opening. The freed slaves were forced to huddle in the small room at night. Iron bars were set into the one opening with no glass or protection from the weather. On the 3rd floor, a whipping post was built into the walls. Virgilia Ellis of Kingsport spoke to the Douglas Alumni blog about her experiences working at the plantation as a child and the treatment her family had experienced while under Philps' cruel hand. I grew up on the 2,500 or so more acres of Rotherwood land. My mother, Inez Looney, was the cook, and my father, James Looney, was the chauffeur, the butler, and the mansion's maitre d'. As a child, I had to go into this area, the slave sales, almost every day because the food my mother canned was stored in the facility. And the laundry room was also in this area. The stench was embedded into the ground. The darkness and the dampness was sometimes overpowering. One could imagine hearing the moaning, the wailing, the crying of the slaves, their misery and their despair. If a slave was maimed, he was executed like an animal because he was of no more use. In the front room of the third floor, facing the river, was a whipping post. Slaves were shackled to the post to be whipped. The red stains are still embedded into the wood floors of that room. During the days of heavy moisture, the wood would expand and the red stains would show again. Phillips put the post into the house because he enjoyed hearing his slaves scream. In fact, he was known to be so vicious with them, to beat them so furiously that neighboring plantations and landowners reported hearing the screams of the slaves, echoing off the mountains as Philps would torture them. Astoundingly, Philps was not alone in his evil. He had a mistress on the side. His wife knew about it and was too scared and powerless to stop him, who was a slave herself, who was reported to be as cruel to her fellow slaves, if not cruel, than Philps himself. His evil did not stop at the slaves and his treatment of them. Philps was just as cruel with his own family and had a strange request about his passing. As recounted by a former slave, in October of 1975, a woman named Aunt Vic Philps told Edward Stewart in an article about Rotherwood just how far his evil went. Aunt Vic was a slave before the Civil War, and she told Stewart about hiding in the reeds and ditches, so when slave traders would come, she would not be sold away from her mother. Aunt Vic told Stewart that Philps was often overheard stating that when he passed, he wanted to be buried standing up on the top of the hill at Rotherwood so he could always be looking down into the bottoms and see the slaves working. Philps had a daughter, Priscilla, who had fallen in love with a young man, a farmhand. The Civil War had struck and her young suitor was called off to battle. Philps hated the young man and had him unalived in action, telling his daughter what he did and why he did it. Priscilla herself passed from depression and grief at the age of 20, a widow. There was a short battle on the grounds of Rotherwood during the war, but as fate would have it, there was one last nightmarish tragedy set to unfold on the grounds. One that would leave its scars physically and echoes of terror for years to come. In the summer of 1861, Philps himself fell ill. The doctor could not explain his condition. He was feverish, almost delusional, afraid of contagions. The cruel man, now debilitated by sickness, was moved out and quarantined in the carriage house. A young slave boy was assigned to keep watch over him and to fan him to keep him cool for days. Philps lingered half awake in fever with labored breathing until finally demise came for Philps in a way that only a man of his nature could deserve. In fact, no one has an explanation for his passing or the circumstances in which it occurred. Can a man be so evil that death itself manifests directly and comes to take him from this world? Maybe. One sweltering afternoon, the slave boy was fanning Philps as he was assigned when suddenly Philps, for the first time in days, snapped fully awake. His eyes roving wildly in their sockets, seemed to fixate on a point high in the air above and behind the young boy. Turning to see what his master saw, the boy himself let out a scream of absolute horror. A sickly, buzzing cloud had begun to form in the midair, wriggling and swarming, and it took the boy all of 2 seconds to realize what it was. It was hundreds of flies. The cloud of flies got thicker and thicker until finally the entire cloud itself descended onto Philps. covering his face, crawling and running all over his forehead, their tiny hairy legs poking into his open eyes as they rammed themselves up his nostrils, into his ears, and finally down his open, screaming mouth. The swarm was so thick that Philps finally started to suffocate. Choking to his demise on the living, buzzing flies, unrelenting, the flies kept coming. As the young boy, scared out of his mind, watched his master quickly go into spasms as to his tormentor and owner's lungs filled with the insects as Philps finally passed with a buzzing rattle. Finally regaining his senses, the boy bolted off to the house to get help. When he returned with family and the doctor, Philps lay deceased, his eyes staring up, his mouth slack and frozen on his face, with a look of terror. There wasn't a fly in sight. They had vanished as though they had never existed at all. His passing was something out of the books of hell, but Joshua Phillips was not to be gotten rid of so easily. His funeral, even today, is something of a legend around locals whose great-great-grandparents were there and who passed the story down to their descendants. One such descendant, folklorist and historian Nancy Acuff, personally confirmed as true as told to her from the first-person account of her great-great-grandfather who was present. The funeral of the most hated man in Kingsport was more of a social event of the summer than a somber occasion. The funeral casket was to be pulled by 2 large horses up and around to the cemetery plots on the grounds. During the funeral, it seemed that a storm was coming, the wind picking up the skirts of those around and making the black covering on the casket move ever so slightly, just enough to make one wonder if the man himself were really deceased. As the procession up the hill began, the 2 horses began to struggle, digging deep furrows into the earth, as though the load were too heavy for them to budge. Unable to move the casket, 2 more horses were attached, and slowly the cart began to move again, each horse straining to make the wheels turn with its unnatural weight. Overhead, the skies began to grow from a promise of rain, as thunder began to roll. Just before they reached the cemetery, a bolt of lightning snapped, cutting a tree in 2, knocking the trunk violently across the path, blocking the road. The onlookers began to mutter about evil and God as the pallbearer simply picked up the casket and carried it into the open graveside, where the pastor waited to lay the man to rest. As the pastor began to give Philps' final words, the thunder grew worse and movement drew attention. The casket under the cloth was moving. They heard what sounded like claws against wood, and with a whir, a huge black dog bolted out of the casket. As the attendants screamed in terror, the dog snarled at them with gleaming eyes before bolting off and vanishing into the woods. The casket itself was unharmed. Shaken and scared, the onlookers rushed the pastor, who himself was terrified, finishing the rites. Philps' coffin was hastily buried. As the onlookers moved to go back down the hill, the rain began to fall. There was another sound, the sound of laughter, as they said belonged to Philps. 2 weeks later, Rotherwood was still moving on, though without its cruel master. It was somewhat quieter. The family began to whisper of things moving in shadows, hearing animal feet running in hallways, and most horrifying of all, the sound of laughter of Philps stalking his way around the home as he would appear at night at the foot of the bed, yanking the covers off, keeping everyone from sleeping. But it wasn't only the family that had these troubles. The slaves were coming in droves to the point of a riot to claim that the ghost of Philps had come in from the grave along with a giant black dog to torment them every night. Fed up with these reports, the new overseers and the family, to calm their fears, agreed that Philps' grave would be exhumed to prove once and for all he was truly deceased. Opening the grave turned up more mysteries and terror than anyone imagined. The coffin was still there, and once opened, it was empty. All but a few large, dark dog hairs. Stunned, no one knew what happened to Philps' body, as the dirt around the grave wasn't disturbed. Not long after, violence struck Rotherwood again as slaves, unable to bear the torment from their unseen attackers, revolted, destroying Philps' headstone, desecrating his grave, and finally, at last, unaliving their last torturer, Philps' equally cruel mistress. They struck her till her passing. What happened to her body is unknown. Rotherwood itself was purchased by the U.S. government in 1940, and Mrs. Ellis and her family moved to North Carolina. But it wasn't the end of the story or the end of Rotherwood, passing through several owners. A prominent OBGYN at the local medical campus purchased it. She began to renovate and restore the home to its former glory. Even in modern times, however, Rotherwood still holds darkness. During the renovations, the owner and her friends were both at the house as workmen were working on plumbing and wiring in the basement where the former slave cells were located. One of the workmen claimed that his partner looked up from work and froze in place, his skin going white and his eyes widening. His partner began to scream and run, fleeing up the stairs. Astounding, the owner, her friends, and the workmen watched as the man leaped into the work van and fled, leaving his tools and his partner behind. Later, the man calmed enough to tell them what had happened. He said he had been working, looked up when he felt like he was being watched, saw a man materialize out of the wall dressed in a dark suit. Next to him, a huge black dog with glowing eyes, mouth open, fangs exposed, and snarling deep in its throat. The man had looked at him, grinning a sadistic smile, and pointed at him. Instantly, the dog leapt for his throat, and that's why he ran, because the dog that no one could see was chasing him. He said the dog followed him up out of the basement to the van and even a bit down the road before vanishing into thin air. The workman said he would never set a foot on the property again, and he never did. The Hound of Hell and the apparitions are of not only Philps, but also Rowena Ross, Priscilla, and the spirits of slaves unalived on the ground are said to wander the property. Most are harmless, save Philps and the dog. During thunderstorms, the baying of the hound, almost screaming, and Philps is there unseen, laughing his cruel life. Side note. The house was built in 3 parts. The north third of the house was built about 1818. The south third of the house, parallel, was built about 1820, and they were joined about 1845. Rowena's fiancé, who drowned in the Holston River, would leave wet footprints that led up to the outside steps to the front door. Frederick Ross was the founder of Rossville that was later merged with Christianville to become Kingsport or Kingsport. Joshua Phillips married 3 times. Rowena is known as the Lady in White, dressed in her wedding gown, forever searching for her lost love. Frederick A. Ross was a reverend. Frederick A. Ross was born on December the 25th, 1796 in Cumberland County, Virginia. Sometime after 1815, after marrying Theodoria Vance, Ross emancipated his slaves and indentured servants and entered into the Presbyterian ministry. He would then acquire or inherit more slaves. Rowena was born on September the 2nd, 1824. She was sent to the finest boarding schools in the North to get her education. With her raven hair, fair complexion, and famed beauty, she was also well educated, very well liked, kind, and had great manners. By this time, her father would be a billionaire. Her beauty, mannerisms, and economic and social statuses, as well as her education, made her a sought-after bride in the who's who of Tennessee prominent families. Rowena drowned April the 5th, 1857. It is claimed Rowena is seen walking along the banks of the river searching for her love, and sometime of the couple standing on the steps of the mansion in wedding attire, very happy together. Other legends include stories of underground passageways, trapdoors, secret rooms, torture chambers, whipping posts on the 3rd floor, and slave shackles in the cellar, and that Phillips was buried upside down to prevent him returning from the grave. David Ross, Frederick Ross's father, owned the Rotherwood property for years before his son built Rotherwood. That is the story of Rotherwood in Kingsport, Tennessee. It's not too far from where I'm at. All these stories tend to be within probably a 3 or 4 hour journey from where I'm at right now. So I hope you enjoyed this story. I hope you got to learn something new. A lot of this, take it for what it is. Folklore, legends, truth. I'm just reading to you what I had discovered. So I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, to subscribe, to hit that notification button, and to share this video. I truly, truly appreciate it. So until next time, I'll see you on the flip side. Bye.